If you have a podcast, listener feedback is potentially one of the most important things that everybody wants, right? You're talking and you don't want to be an echo of yourself. You want people to reply. Well, as a podcast host, you have too much feedback and you're like, how do I understand what actually makes sense for me? I don't want to be canceled, or I just don't know, like if this aligns with my content strategy. Or you may be on the other side, which is nobody's talking to me. So this podcast episode is going to be covering all of that and how to understand listener feedback, a few things that you may not know, and so that you feel better when you are getting listener feedback and you know what to do with it. If we haven't met, hello, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. This podcast is a space that will help elevate your podcast journey, but also get you the clarity that you need to grow your show and to make your podcast dreams come true. All right, without further ado, let's get into the episode. If you feel like you've been talking to the void and you want more feedback, listener, trust me, you're not alone, because we only get to see about 10% of our impact. And so if you happen to have less than 100 listeners per episode, well, it's just a numbers game, right? And also just depends on the topic that you're talking about. But if you are on the opposite spectrum where you are just afraid of creating some more controversial episodes because you feel like you're going to get a lot of listener feedback and you're just not sure what to do with it, well, you're also not alone, because I was just attending a conference over the weekend and somebody said exactly that thing. They're like, well, I have a lot of ideas, but I'm afraid of being canceled. And of course, like, you can't really always say, this is the strategy. I always talk about this on the podcast, right? How every podcast is unique, every strategy is unique. But at the core, what I want you to ask yourself is, 1, why am I doing this? And 2, is listener feedback important to me? For the majority of people, a majority of podcasts will say, yes, podcast listener feedback is really important to me. Okay, so if that's the case, and what I think is really, really important is figure out, where does that feedback align? In case you didn't know, I'm a content strategist, and basically what I do is just have content ideas all the time. Just like you do with your content ideas, episode ideas, some ideas work, other ideas don't. And it's the same thing as listener feedback. Some feedback will align and will make sense, and some feedback, just either toss it in the bin or put it as a reminder, because sometimes it's important. Some listener feedback will give you insight into either topics that you didn't cover, kind of like blind spots in your content strategy, or as a business owner, that it's actually an opportunity, a missed opportunity that you may have never considered, and that listeners can kind of like highlight that for you, right? So first things first, don't take it personal, right? Like, you don't take everybody's opinions and say, okay, oh my God, I'm distraught. How could this person say this about me? Like, in real life, you don't take every single piece of feedback of like just regular people and implement it in your life, right? Sometimes you're like, sure, I agree. And other times you're like, absolutely not. So same thing with a podcast. I know that this is a little simplistic, but I promise you that sometimes we get so much in our heads, so afraid of like what people will say because, you know, we're more out there, right? And so it's totally understandable that you're worried about what your listeners may say. But just like anything in life, like, does this make sense on your current strategy? So there are seasons in life where you can take listener feedback and you're like, okay, great, I will improve the podcast. And there are seasons in life when you're like, nope, I've determined that I need to create a 5-part series for, you know, like, I don't know, like a 5-part series on content because I have a mini course coming out. And so I want to prime listeners for their product. So at that time, you maybe just have done a lot of homework on the pain points, on the structure of the episodes, and putting listener feedback there. Sometimes for some people can really send them into analysis paralysis. And so sometimes you gotta say, okay, it will be great for an upcoming episode after I launch this season. Or sometimes, and we will get into how to determine that, like sometimes that listener feedback is really, really relevant and you have to pivot tremendously. But again, as I always say, think about the type of person you are. And if you get really stressed out just thinking about having to change everything, well, then don't, right? So it's about being sustainable. So something that you have to remember is that there will be direct listener feedback and indirect listener feedback. Direct listener feedback is the kind of feedback that is given to you in written form, in voice messages, like people actually tell you, right? The indirect one is when they either, one, don't engage with your content, or just things that you can track, like your podcast hosting platforms. Like if you go into Apple Podcasts and you're looking at episode consumption, that is indirect listener feedback. So basically, people are, by their actions, telling you if they like an episode or not. When I receive a message from my listeners who I love and adore, that I receive messages amazing like, hey, I listened to this episode 4 times. This was so good. Thank you so much, right? Like, this is kind of feedback that I'm like, all right, like that topic was super important. I need to think about like, how did I deliver the information? What was special about it? I already kind of know what was about it. Whenever I'm talking about content strategy itself, like I just, I light up, I get excited, I get you excited. And because the content is so practical, you feel like you can do this, right? Like you're listening to me, you're like, yes, Anna, let's go. So that's one of the reasons that I filter listener feedback through, right? Like I also think about like, how was I? Was I really insecure? Was this maybe a topic that I had to kind of like put together because it was last minute? Like maybe I had some tech issues, whatever it was, you have to think about it, like also like the causes of it. So how do you determine if the feedback is actually worthwhile? Number 1, ask yourself, have I heard it before? And this is where keeping an idea, like episode idea, and I talk about this all the time, you should track your ideas, you should track your episode, kind of like guest ideas as well, because there'll be a point where sometimes you're like, I really don't know what to talk about. And so if people comment on social media, if people send you emails, start collecting those comments, because those, one, they tell you how they are using, which words they're using, which it's super important for you to talk about things in a way that your listeners are talking about, right? Like you're using the same language. So make sure that, again, you're collecting all of those ideas, because sometimes what it happens is, you start collecting all of these ideas and there's a lot of trends. And so you could create, a mini series out of that. In fact, this episode is actually coming out of my listener, Michelle. So she commented that her podcast is, it's growing, but the kind of only feedback she was getting at the time was really from friends and family. And that is the type of content that if you're not creating content for your friends and family, they're the type of audiences and listeners that you don't need to listen, right? Like if your podcast is about, podcasting, and my mom or my dad are listening to the podcast, they may have feedback that they're not going to start a podcast. So they're not my ideal listener. Therefore, I thank them for their feedback, but I'm not going to implement it, right? So again, does this person align? And so you should make sure that you listen to the 3 types of podcast listeners. Super important. Make sure that I included that in the show notes. But so going back to our list, right? Like, have you heard it before? If you've heard it multiple times, strong indication that you should incorporate that comment into your content strategy, right? Or into maybe changing the format. If they are telling you like, hey, I really love this episode, but I felt really overwhelmed, that's a reminder to create shorter podcast episodes, or create a 2-part series, just like I've done with my episodes with Sarah McDowell on SEO, episode 41 and 42. I did that on the fly. If you want to see how I've done it in real time, I was like, oh my gosh, we're going over the time. It's already like, I think at the time we were recording, it was like 45 minutes. And I was like, we really need to break this down, right? So if your listeners are saying, I love this, but I can't ever finish the episode, or you're looking in the back end of your podcast analytics platform, and the consumption is like 50%, 40%, that is listener feedback that you have to pay attention. But that is when you need to map that out against is that relevant for what I'm doing, right? So if you're doing your podcast and your podcast is just for networking with decision makers and you don't care about the, like, quote unquote, the audience, like, it's not going to be relevant, right? And I'm almost like already combining a few elements. But if you've heard it multiple times before, there's a need. So pay attention to it. And then, is this something that you feel in your gut too? Sometimes we are waiting for our listeners to tell us. We're almost like looking for an excuse for us to act on things that we've been wanting to do. Maybe we have a co-host and we want to stop doing the podcast with them and we want to do a solo episode. And you listen to your listeners telling you like, oh my gosh, I really love your solo episodes. I really connect with you. Or more of the solo episodes, please. That is listener feedback that you have to pay attention, especially if you felt like maybe the dynamic is off with your co-host, right? Or maybe you just want to try a new specific type of content in your content pillars, which I'll also link in the show notes because I forgot that episode is amazing. So I'll make sure that it's there. Number 3. Could there be more context that explains all of these people suddenly talking about it? And so a great example of this is, for instance, when I'm talking about like my video episode. So basically I said 15 considerations that you need before launching a video on YouTube or doing a video podcast, which of course, I'll link in the show notes. But my God, these episodes is like, listen to episode whatever. Just like, Anna, stop giving me homework. Sorry. Well, you don't have to listen to all of them. But here's the truth. When YouTube is back on the news, like saying like, okay, YouTube is being able to pull podcasts directly from where you host your podcast. Like, I know that a lot of people will be like, oh, is it still worthwhile for me to do video? Like, that is something that I know a lot of people will be asking me about. And so I got already ahead of them, and I'm going to be just sending them the link to the episode and say, hey, I actually created a whole podcast episode on this. Have a listen. So again, there will be a lot of interest on that topic again. And because I've already created that video, I may not have to create something. But if I had not created, I'm going to be looking at that as an opportunity and say, okay, within my goals for the podcast, do I need to create a podcast about that topic that is going to be cyclical, right? And it's going to come back around? Or do I need to look at it from like, okay, it's just not going to be quote unquote evergreen. It's not going to happen again. Do I want to go through the bother of creating that thing that may be going away and never again maybe to return unless there's a resurgence on that? And so another one is like, how many people are actually saying that thing? We can feel like we want to be accommodating for everyone, but at the same time, there's so many times where I get asked like, hey, Anna, can you create a podcast episode on equipment? And I'm like, I'm not going to do that because that's not what I do on this show, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm still going to make you feel important by saying, hey, my friend Eric, who is the host of the Clipped podcast, he talks about equipment all the time. So how about you listen to his show, right? So I don't have to implement every single thing that listeners are asking about. I can be clever and collaborative, right? And send them Eric's way. But again, is this one person trying to, and this is where you have to be really protective of your energy. Is this person just like, again, we're all in a way selfish, right? So we're like, oh, I really would love for you to create something. And again, that's when you have to wait. Does it really align with your content strategy, with your values, with what you're trying to achieve long term? Because even if that podcast episode gets really, really popular, there's a chance that the people that it will attract, they will not be aligned with what you want to do with the podcast. And so either you start getting more feedback on people that clearly do not align, or they subscribe, but they don't listen to the show, right? So it's almost like ghost subscribers, right? So again, does it make sense? Are they an exception? Are they the rule? The last thing that I wanted to consider is that different platforms will give you different feedback. And this is something that I don't think I've talked about before a lot, but there's a difference between YouTube and podcast platforms. And I see this across the board with all the clients that I've produced content for over the years. Different platforms will give you indirect listener feedback. So basically, if you're uploading your audio podcast to, like for instance, Captivate, that's where my podcast is hosted, and YouTube, I always get really different engagement on both. So basically some episodes that are more like how-tos or more visuals or more about mindset, those will really perform super well on YouTube. And then the other ones, content strategy, those will be doing really, really well on audio podcast platforms. So again, like I just know that YouTube is more about the discoverability. And so I know that the people listening on YouTube, and I have to be okay with that, right? And so, but if I say my goal is to grow YouTube, I have to be listening to the feedback that I'm being given on YouTube. And if I say, okay, audio only episodes are just there for me to be in a platform where my listeners can be driving or can be, it's just in terms of accessibility is easier, well then do it, right? So again, mapping it all back to, does it align with what I want to do long term, with my values and all of that? And so before we move ahead, I want to make sure that you also understand if you're trying to get more feedback because you're just not getting any, I've created this 2 episodes that I think are worthwhile listening, episodes 17 and 21. Episode 17 is the 5 practical ways to increase listener trust, connection, and emotional resonance. Like, this episode will help you turn passive listeners into people who actually message you, right? Super important. And then episode 21 is how to create a content strategy that anticipates your podcast listeners' thoughts. And this is super, super helpful if you're a small business owner. If you're creating content that is just for like passion project, this is probably not going to be interesting you. But if you are a small business owner, listen to that. All right, so I want to make sure that if you're just wanting 3 tips, quick tips to improve listener feedback, here they are. All right, number 1, ask yourself, have I been giving them a reason to actually engage? I received a message from someone on Instagram that told me, oh my gosh, you really got me thinking about how I'm doing my teasers, because normally at the end, I just literally just say, hey, new episode is out. The listener is not expecting anything, right? Like, they're not expected to say anything at all, right? So basically, think about like, are your teasers, do they end with a question? If they don't end with a question, at the end, can you add a little slide and just say, hey, how about you? What are you thinking about? You know, blank, insert whatever it is that you're talking about. Or just at the end, just make sure that your call to action actually invites people to engage. And one of the things you have to be careful about, if you're not asking someone to pour down their dirtiest secrets online, right? Or talk about grief and pain in a very public place, they may not want to do it. So make sure that you say something like, again, like messages on the DMs, emails, that's listener engagement as well, right? So just say, hey, I know this is a really difficult topic. Feel free to DM me privately. We can talk about it, right? So not all outward feedback is the type of feedback they should be paying attention to. If you're creating stories on Instagram or temporary content, those messages count a lot as feedback on your podcast. And I feel like as podcasters, we tend to compartmentalize the type of content that we're putting out there and say, oh, you know, my podcast content isn't performing as well. But also, how are you positioning the podcast content, right? Like, you can promote the podcast multiple times and play around with what performs best, or take the types of content that are related to your podcast and like what did well. And so just start looking for those clues everywhere. And then number 2, post random things. I know, like, test what works. On my last podcast episode with Sarah, where we talk about SEO, it was one of those days that, you know, like, you already know that you have 2 podcast episodes. I had been a little sick the day before, so I couldn't really record an intro. And so that day I was just super tired. And I went outside and my neighbor's cat was sitting right in front of my door. And I thought, oh my God, this is so funny, because in my mind, that's what I thought, like, people are waiting for the episode to drop. By the way, not always everyone is waiting, but you acted as a double take. So one, to remind people that there was like an episode coming up if they forgot, fair. And if they had been waiting, they felt seen, right? They're like, oh yeah, like, she does know that I'm waiting on the episode, because part 2 took a bit longer to drop. Like, part 1, and I'm going on a tangent right now, but something that I always talk about is, like, if you have some sort of content that needs to go out, put the audio episode out first and then do everything else, right? Like, the episode can download, like, the show notes can be a bit more basic, but then you can go ahead and write everything else in there, right? Be mindful of like what you're doing and how like you can get something out there for them. So again, that episode, it's so funny because I didn't do like a really fancy, I just put the image of the cat like waiting. I put some like cute gif where the eyes are kind of like, you know, it's almost like puppy eyes. And so I had something like, oh, how I'm imagining my listeners waiting for the episode to drop. And actually someone who never engaged with my content engaged for the first time and they said like, oh my gosh, this episode was so great, right? So it's like the random things that sometimes make people somehow one day, they're like, you know what? This is the thing that's going to make me engage. And again, it's not like the most clever. It's not the sickest camera. It's a freaking picture of a cat, So again, think about like, are you overthinking? Are you trying to create things too perfect, too polished, too clean? And you're showcasing yourself as almost like untouchable. So I am a goof. I am always making sure that you feel like you can talk to me anywhere. And again, there's like no difference, right? So my personal brand and my the podcast space brand, they're very aligned because of that. I want you to feel that you can approach me. All right, and the last one is look at the user experience. And what I mean by this is there an actual easy way for people to engage with the content? I know it's simple as that. But one of my clients one time, she had posted a really cool teaser and I wanted to share it with my community because it was such a really cool teaser in the way that they did it. And then her account had that disabled. Like she couldn't share that video. And I was like, that was, she literally could not get some of the feedback there because there was some sort of random limitation. And so again, she couldn't get feedback because there was no platform to do it through, right? For instance, Spotify has those Q&A cards that say, hey, what did you think about this episode? Great tool to use if you have your podcast on Spotify. You can use this even if your podcast isn't hosted on Spotify. If you haven't done it, do it. If you're listening to this podcast episode on Spotify, please go ahead and tell me that you listened to it and you're going to be trying this, these cards or not. You can actually change the questions. So if you're doing it on social media, again, do you have a setup that is making it easier for them to give you feedback? And a clear example of this is I'm telling you, talk to me on Instagram all the time. I just give you an option, which is concrete option, which is Spotify for podcasters. If you're listening to this on YouTube, then you can do it. But I'm giving you very concrete actions to do. I'm not just saying, hey, talk to me, right? Because most people, again, they are going to look at a podcast host and think they're a celebrity or they're a stranger, as I always talk about it. So when we don't just go and talk to strangers. So again, what is the process to talk to you? Could there be any elements that are limiting that? So have just a mini quick audit to make sure that everything is possible. Maybe they cannot message you on Instagram or on LinkedIn. Sounds crazy. Sometimes happens. So I feel like this episode was plenty full. I hope you came out of it realizing when it's good to implement podcast listener feedback and when you don't need to worry about it. Just let me know if you had any ahas. Let me know on Instagram. I am at The Podcast Space. And of course, all the information included in the show notes will be available at thepodcastspace.com/podcast. And this is episode 43. I will include the links to all the podcast episodes that I've mentioned. There were a lot in this one. And if you do want additional information, you can always subscribe to the Podcast Spaces newsletter. I send out 2 emails a week. The Wednesday one is just an automated email when a new episode drops. You get an email on your email. That's so meta. And then on Fridays is a more thought out take on podcasting with a lot of links and resources. Okay, I had so much fun talking to you about listener feedback. I've been Anna Xavier, and I'll see you on the next episode. Until then, just keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. Bye.